troops, led by Field Marshal Tannenberg, retreat in the face of a crushing green onslaught. The capture of the elusive Tannenberg will mean the surrender of the Tan Army and restore freedom to our world. Missing from the impending victory celebration is General Plastro. What has become of the demented dictator? Rumor has it that he has been trapped in the other world, a victim of plastification. But what exactly is plastification?
Plastification is a condition that occurs when too much time is spent in the other world. Its symptoms are the hardening of the limbs, known in layman's terms as getting plastered.
Fortunately, General Grimm and the brave soldiers of the Green Army have been successful in locating and destroying these dangerous portals as they mysteriously appear across the land. This is Vicky G, signing off.
Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 might well be the best game in the series. I'm partial to Army Men 2, but unless one of the few later releases that I haven't played in years is a lot better than I remember, Sarge's Heroes 2 is probably the best game from an objective standpoint. Now, if you go on Metacritic or GameSpot or similar sites, you'll see the exact opposite. A lot of those sites say that Sarge's 2 is worse than the original game. I firmly disagree with that, and I think that critics are generally wrong about Army Men, at least from an experience standpoint. The games may be rough visually, and sometimes have unfair difficulty curves, okay, more often than not, but they're dumb fun, and that's an oft underestimated part of the video game experience. Sarge's Heroes 2 is a direct sequel to the first Sarge's Heroes. After the events of the first game, General Plastro was trapped in the real world, where he was eventually plastered, or frozen in place as an actual toy soldier due to staying in the real world for too long. After a series of military defeats in Plastro's absence, Colonel Grimm convinces the acting Tan commander, Field Marshal Tannenberg, to agree to an armistice. Unbeknownst to either Grimm or Tannenberg, Bridget Blue, a spy from the Blue Nation, has an anti-plastification serum developed by the Grey scientist Dr. Mad. Despite being from a different universe, this is the same, or at least a parallel version, of the Mad Grey scientist from Army Men 2. And Bridget revives Plastro. After rebuilding his forces at a toy store, Plastro bursts through a portal and assaults the peace treaty signing event, thus ensuring that the war between Green and Tan would continue. Most people, or at least most fellow Army Men fans I've discussed the game with, seem to like the lighter story here more than the previous game's story with its overt mentions of death rays and torture. I, on the other hand, usually prefer darker stories, so while I prefer this game over the first one, I found the previous game's story to be a little more interesting. That's just a personal preference, though, not a point for or against either game. In the first Sarge's Heroes, the 4 versions of the game were sort of split into 2 builds, but they were relatively identical to one another outside of graphical quality. That's largely the same here, but not exactly. The Nintendo 64 version of the game came out first, a few months prior to the PlayStation version's release. But while they have identical stories, the PlayStation version was actually built from the ground up separately from the Nintendo 64 version. When the PlayStation 2 version came out a year later, rather than being based on the PlayStation version, 3DO took the N64 version, and adapted and improved it for the PS2 release. It's probably a good thing too, as the PS1 version is by far the worst looking of the 3, and actually looks worse in my opinion than Sarge's Heroes did on the system. There are some exclusive features to each version as well. The N64 version gets an exclusive level, not present in the PS1 or PS2 versions. The PS2 version gets dramatically improved visuals and, in some cases, completely redone models. The PS1 version gets disappointment. That's about it. Jokes aside though, there are 4 weapons and 6 enemies that only appear in the PS1 version, as well as 1 enemy that appears in the N64 and PS2 versions, but not in the PS1 version. Most noteworthy here, to me at least, is that 3DO didn't make the same mistake with the 6th gen release of Sarge's Heroes 2 that they did with Sarge's Heroes. Sarge's Heroes on Dreamcast, like the PS2 version of Sarge's Heroes 2, was based on the N64 version. With the first game, however, that included the lack of FMV cutscenes, despite the Dreamcast's GD-ROM format having more than enough space for the FMV scenes. With Sarge's Heroes 2, however, the PlayStation 2 is a truly definitive version, minus that one N64 level and a few PS1 exclusive weapons and enemies, but those are minor details. Not only does the PS2 version have the PS1's cutscenes, but they've been remastered to look much better and run much smoother, in addition to running at a higher resolution. It really makes me wish even more that Sarge's Heroes on Dreamcast had been given the same treatment. In terms of performance, the versions rank just like you'd expect. PS1 has the most instances of slowdown, at least from my experience, with N64 suffering from some slowdown as well, but not quite to the same degree. PS2 version, on the other hand, wins hands down, with very little slowdown and drastically improved visuals. I do have one gripe with the PS2 visuals though, and this is completely subjective, but the zombies outside of Dr. Mad's castle in the graveyard level don't look as cool on PS2 as they do on PS1 and N64. They definitely look better, and they look more like actual zombies, but that honestly takes away part of its charm. In the 5th gen versions of the game, they look like they do in Army Men 2 and Toys in Space, shambling army men with limbs of all different colors. You can still see some color variation on PS2, but the new models for that system look too much like actual toy zombies and not enough like Army Men zombies for my taste. Really though, like I said, personal preference, subjective, and really my only gripe about that version. As far as music goes, Sarge's Heroes sub-series is 2 for 2. The music is fantastic and even better than it was in the previous game, which, before this one, had been the series' high point in my opinion. I may not have liked the story in Sarge's Heroes 2 quite as much as I liked that in the previous game, but the missions in Sarge's Heroes 2 win hands down. You spend a lot of time in the real world in this game, where it was fairly scarce in the previous one, and that's definitely to this game's benefit. The most memorable and iconic mission in the whole game, in my opinion, is the refrigerator level. You have to climb your way up inside this fridge, fighting tan soldiers along the way, while you search for and destroy cans of deplastification spray. It's a pretty short level, but that's true of most levels in this game. Only one level took me more than 10 minutes to complete, excluding deaths and restarts, and that only took 12 minutes, with most missions in the game averaging probably 5 or 6 minutes once I knew what I was doing. That's not a bad thing though. One of my biggest complaints with the previous game was that the increasingly long levels added difficulty through an obnoxious method with the lack of mid-level checkpoints. There are still no checkpoints here, but that's not as bad with levels that take less time to complete fully, versus a checkpoint maybe a third of the way through a level in Sarge's Heroes, but with some of those later levels taking 20 or 30 minutes. Even if you get killed at the very end of a level in Sarge's Heroes 2, you've only lost 5 or 6 minutes, not 10 or 20. For me, there are few games quite as nostalgic as Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2. I used to play this for hours on my Nintendo 64 with friends when I was in elementary school. I even had action figures of Sergeant Hawk and General Plastro when I was a kid. It may not look or play quite as brilliantly as it does in my childhood memories, but that doesn't mean it's not a genuinely good game. The auto-aim is a little more irritating and less reliable than the previous game, and, at least on PS1, it doesn't look as good as the previous game. But the visuals did see a bit of improvement on Nintendo 64, and the PlayStation 2 version truly does look like it's a generation ahead, whereas the Dreamcast version of the previous game looked markedly better, but only barely a quote-unquote generational leap, if at all. Whether it's the local deathmatch multiplayer or the cheesy but fun as hell single player, Sarge's Heroes 2 is definitely a game you need to play. If you collect for Nintendo 64, this is absolutely a mandatory edition, especially if you can get the green cartridge. If you collect for PlayStation, you should snag this one just because there are so many Army Men games on the console, and they look great on a shelf next to one another. If you collect for PlayStation 2, there are still 5 Army Men games on PS2, 6 if you count Portal Runner, but I wouldn't say it's as much of a collection must-have as it is for PS1 or N64, although the PS2 version is the definitive way to play the game. Whatever retro console you prefer, though, give this game a play. My rating for Army Men Sarge's Heroes 2 on Nintendo 64, PlayStation, and PlayStation 2 is a B.